The dust of Dry Hollow, New Mexico territory, was a fine, reddish powder that settled on everything and in everything. It coated the tongues of men who spoke too long, settled in the creases of a woman's smile, and gave the late afternoon sun a hazy, bruised orange glow. On this day in the autumn of 1876, the dust was being kicked up by the 100 boots of a town determined to be festive. The annual fair was in full swing, a riot of noise and smells that did little to disguise the hardscrabble reality of life on the edge of the known world. There was the scent of roasting corn and spun sugar, a sweet lie against the ever-present smells of livestock, sweat, and cheap whiskey. Fiddles sawed away at a tune that was more enthusiastic than it was melodious, and the laughter of children chasing a greased pig cut through the low hum of gossip, presiding over it all. From the newly constructed bandstand in the center of the square was Sheriff Thaddeus Bragg. He was a man built like an oak barrel, his face a roadmap of sun-baked certainty. His law was the only law that mattered in this corner of the territory, and today he was not a lawman, but a king holding court. His son, Austin Bragg, was his prince. Austin rode a stark white mare that seemed to float above the common dirt, its coat a defiant challenge to the pervasive dust. He was dressed in a tailored suit of black wool that must have been suffocating in the lingering heat, with a silver-stamped leather vest and a string tie. He looked less like a man of the West, and more like a photograph of one from a Chicago newspaper. He dismounted with a flourish, tossing the reins to a young boy who scrambled to catch them, and moved through the crowd like a ship parting water. People made way, some with smiles of deference, others with eyes carefully averted. Ellie Ward watched him from the shade of the livery stable, her back pressed against the rough, sun-warmed wood. She felt less like a guest at this celebration and more like part of the scenery, something to be observed and commented upon but never truly seen. Her calico dress, though clean, was worn thin at the elbows, and the hem was frayed from a snag on a sagebrush bush she'd passed on her walk into town. She didn't belong here, and every smiling face, every polite nod was a reminder of it. She had been with the Braggs for a year now, ever since the fever had taken her father and left her with nothing but his debts and a name nobody cared about. Sheriff Bragg had taken her in. That's what the town said. A charitable act. The preacher's wife called it. Saved that poor girl from starvation. The women whispered over their sewing circles. Ellie knew the truth was a colder, harder thing. She was not saved. She was acquired. She was a debt paid, an obligation fulfilled, and now an ornament for the Bragg household, a testament to the sheriff's magnanimity. Austin reached the bandstand, vaulting onto the platform beside his father. The sheriff clapped him on the shoulder, a proud, proprietary gesture. Someone handed Austin a glass of whiskey, and he held it aloft, the amber liquid catching the dying sun. The fiddles quieted. The crowd turned. Friends. Neighbors. Austin's voice was smooth, practiced, and loud enough to carry over the settling dust. A fine day for Dry Hollow. A fine harvest. My father and I thank you for joining our celebration. A smattering of polite applause followed. Austin let it die down, a smirk playing on his lips. He scanned the crowd, his eyes sweeping past the faces until they found and locked onto Ellie's. He held her gaze, a hunter pinning a butterfly with a look. And we have much to celebrate, he continued, his voice dropping into a more intimate, conspiratorial tone, though it was still for all to hear. New prosperity, new growth, and new futures being forged. Speaking of which, he paused, letting the silence stretch, letting every eye in the square follow his to where Ellie stood. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, sharp and curious as beaks. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the wood behind her, but some hard, defiant stone in her belly wouldn't let her. She kept her chin up. Many of you have seen the lovely Ellie Ward gracing our town this past year, Austin announced, his smirk widening. He made it sound as though she were a prize mare he was showing off. taken in by my father's good grace. She's become part of the family. The way he said it was laced with implication, a meaning as clear as the whiskey in his glass. Some have wondered about her future. Let me put those wonders to rest. She's a brag now, in all but name, and you can all wait for the day we make that official. A brag looks after his own. He raised the glass higher. To what is mine, he declared, and drank it down in one smooth motion. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ellie could hear the sharp giggle of Lavinia May, the blacksmith's daughter, who had always looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. Saved from starvation right into the prince's bed, someone whispered, followed by a stifled laugh. The words were like stones, small and hard, pelting her from all sides. They didn't see a person. They saw a story they could tell themselves, a simple tale of a fortunate orphan. They didn't see the nights she'd lain awake, listening to the sheriff and his son discuss her as if she were a parcel of land. They didn't see the way Austin's hand would linger too long on her arm, his fingers pressing just hard enough to be a reminder of his strength, his ownership. They didn't see the cage, gilded with charity, that had been built around her. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let tears fall. Crying was a weakness she could no longer afford. Instead, her gaze drifted past Austin, past the judging faces of the crowd, to the far edge of the square. There, by the water trough, a man was working, oblivious or indifferent to the drama unfolding on the bandstand. Cody Lane. He was a whisper in a town of loud pronouncements, a shadow. The townsfolk spoke of him in low tones, if they spoke of him at all. He was the cowboy who lived alone in a dugout shelter by the mesas, the man Sheriff Bragg had once arrested for horse thieving, only to let him go for lack of proof. The suspicion, however, clung to him like dust. He kept to himself, earning his keep by breaking wild horses and mending tack for folks who were desperate or didn't care about his reputation. He wasn't handsome in the way Austin was. There was nothing smooth or polished about him. His face was all angles, carved by sun and wind. His clothes were worn, and practical denim trousers faded at the knees, and a plain cotton shirt that had been washed so many times it had lost its color. He moved with a quiet economy, his hands sure and steady as he checked the cinch on a deep brown stallion. He wasn't performing for anyone. He was just there, a fixed point of reality in a world of pretense. Ellie had seen him before, many times. He would ride into town for supplies, his eyes always on the horizon, never meeting anyone's gaze for long. Yet, she had felt his eyes on her. Not in the possessive way Austin looked at her, but in a quiet, assessing way. Once, when she dropped her basket of mending, the spools of thread scattering in the dirt, he had been the one to stop and help her pick them up, his calloused fingers gently placing them back in her basket without a word before he moved on. Another time, she'd seen him leave a small piece of jerky for a stray dog that the other townsfolk kicked at. He was a man of small, silent actions. As Austin basked in the attention of the crowd, Ellie found she couldn't look away from Cody. He finished with the saddle, giving the stallion a final, gentle pat on the neck. For a moment, as if feeling the weight of her stare, he looked up, his eyes, a pale, clear gray like a winter sky, met hers across the dusty expanse. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just held her gaze for a single, long heartbeat. In that look, she saw not pity, but a kind of understanding. It was the look of a man who also knew what it was to be judged, to be an outsider. Then, he turned back to his work, coiling a rope with practiced ease. The moment was broken, but something inside Ellie had shifted. The hard stone of defiance in her belly grew warmer, heavier. Austin was still talking, his voice a drone she no longer heard. The whispers of the crowd faded into white noise. The world narrowed to a single, clear path. She took a breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. It tasted of freedom. Then she stepped out from the shadows of the livery. Her boots made soft thuds in the dirt. The crowd, sensing a new development, fell silent. Austin stopped mid-sentence, a look of pleased surprise on his face. He clearly thought she was coming to him, to stand by his side and accept her role as his prize. He extended a hand towards her, a magnanimous, welcoming gesture. Ellie didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the man at the edge of the square. She walked past the stalls selling pies and ribbons, past the wide-eyed children, past the gossiping women whose mouths were now agape. She felt their stares, but for the first time, they had no power over her. They were merely spectators to a decision she was finally making for herself. Her path was straight and unwavering. She walked right through the center of the crowd, which parted for her as it had for Austin, but this time with a stunned, confused silence. She could feel Austin's smile freezing on his face, his hand still outstretched and empty. She could hear his father, the sheriff, clear his throat, a low, dangerous rumble. She didn't stop. Cody had finished with his rope and was about to mount his horse when he saw her approaching. He froze, one foot in the stirrup, his expression unreadable. He watched her come, his gray eyes missing nothing the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, the frayed hem of her dress. Ellie stopped directly in front of him. She was close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, to smell the scent of leather and clean sweat that clung to him. He was taller than she'd realized, and she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. The whole of Dry Hollow was holding its breath, watching. She didn't say a word. Words were for men like Austin, tools for boasting and claiming. Her actions would have to speak for her. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hand. It trembled slightly, but her resolve was firm. She didn't wait for him to offer his. She reached out and placed her hand in his. His hand was rough and warm, the calluses on his palm a stark contrast to the softness of her own. For a second, he didn't react, his fingers still and unmoving around hers. Then, as if coming to a decision, his hand closed around hers, his grip firm and steady. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of acceptance, a silent acknowledgement. Ellie kept her eyes on his, a world of meaning passing between them in that shared gaze. Then she turned, still holding his hand, and allowed him to help her up onto the stallion behind the saddle. She settled herself, her worn calico dress bunching around her knees, and wrapped her arms around his waist. She did not look back at the bandstand. She did not look back at the shocked face of Austin Bragg or the thunderous expression of his father. She did not look back at the town that had tried to define her. She looked forward, at the wide, unforgiving, and open expanse of the New Mexico territory stretching out before them. Cody swung himself into the saddle, took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, urged the stallion into a steady walk, away from the fair, away from the whispers, away from Dry Hollow. The dust rose behind them, obscuring the view, erasing the past with every step. Ellie leaned her head against Cody's back, feeling the solid strength of him, and for the first time in a very long time, she breathed. The stallion moved with a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat, a solid, living warmth beneath her. With every step it took away from Dry Hollow, Ellie felt a layer of the past year peel away like old, sun-baked paint. Her arms were wrapped around Cody Lane's waist, her cheek resting against the coarse fabric of his shirt. She could feel the subtle shift of his muscles as he guided the horse, a silent and reassuring strength. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the vast, empty landscape in shades of violet and deep orange. The world was quiet now, save for the plodding of hooves and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. It was a quiet that allowed memory to speak. Her mind went back to a different kind of quiet, the stifling, heavy silence of the small room her father had died in, a silence broken only by the ragged sound of his breathing until, finally, it wasn't. The fever had burned through him like a wildfire, leaving nothing but ash and debt. Ellie had sat with him for 3 days, wiping his brow with a damp cloth, her world shrinking to the four walls of that room. When it was over, the silence that followed was bigger and more terrifying than any noise she had ever heard. Sheriff Thaddeus Bragg had come the next day. He hadn't knocked. The door had just opened, and he filled the space, blocking out the light. He wore his silver star, and it seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. He looked at her father's still form on the cot, then at her, his eyes taking in her worn dress, her tear-stained face, her youth. There was no pity in his gaze, only calculation. "Your father, Elias, was a good man," the sheriff had said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first lie. Her father was a desperate man, a dreamer who had chased silver in the hills and found only rocks, borrowing against a future that never came. He owed me a considerable sum. The deed to this claim, his tools, they won't cover half of it. Ellie had said nothing. She was 18, alone, and the most powerful man in the territory was standing in her doorway, talking about her father like a failed business venture. "You've got nowhere to go," he stated. It wasn't a question. It wouldn't be Christian to leave a girl on her own. "You'll come and stay at my house. You can help Mrs. Gable with the chores. Earn your keep. We'll consider your father's debt settled." That was the word he used, settled, as if she were the final payment, the last piece of property to be transferred. It was not a rescue, it was a foreclosure. The townsfolk called it charity. They smiled at her in the street, praising the sheriff's good heart. But Ellie knew. From that first day, she understood that she had not been given a home, but a new kind of cage. The Bragg house was the largest in Dry Hollow, a 2-story timber building with glass windows and a porch that wrapped all the way around. To anyone else, it was a mansion. To Ellie, it was a prison of polished wood and quiet obligation. Her room was in the back, small and plain, with a window that looked out onto a dusty alley. She was given work from sunup to sundown, mending, cleaning, helping the stout, silent housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. She was fed and clothed, but freedom was never on the menu. Every plate of food, every yard of fabric for a new dress, was a silent reminder of her debt. And then there was Austin. At first, his attention was a confusing, almost welcome thing in the lonely landscape of her new life. He would bring her things: a piece of candy from the general store, a ribbon he'd ordered from a catalog. But the gifts always came with a price. The ribbon was not for her to wear when she chose, but for him to see in her hair at dinner. If she forgot, his face would cloud over, a quiet, wounded look that made her feel cruel and ungrateful. He never raised his voice, not then. His control was quieter, more insidious. He began to curate her life. He decided the books she read were not suitable for a young lady, replacing her father's worn volumes of adventure with dry books of etiquette. He would appear at her side if she paused in town to speak for more than a minute with anyone, especially a man her own age. He would slide his arm around her shoulders, a gesture that looked protective to outsiders but felt like a chain to her. "Ellie is a part of our family now," he would say, his smile never reaching his eyes. "We have to look after her." The jealousy was a living thing, a shadow that followed her. One afternoon, she had been walking by the creek and saw a patch of Indian paintbrush, their fiery orange petals a slash of impossible color against the brown earth. She picked a single stem and tucked it into the buttonhole of her dress. When Austin saw it that evening, his jaw tightened. "Where did you get that weed?" he asked, his voice low. "By the creek," she answered, confused. He reached out, his fingers plucking the flower from her dress. He didn't look at it. He just crushed the delicate petals in his fist and let them fall to the floor. "If you want flowers, Ellie, you tell me. I'll buy you proper roses. A Bragg woman doesn't adorn herself with ditch weeds." A Bragg woman. The phrase chilled her to the bone. She was not a ward anymore, not in his mind. She was a thing to be polished, shaped, and displayed, a possession. The first time she tried to run, it was an act of pure desperation. After 3 months of suffocating under the Braggs' roof, she waited until the house was dark and silent, then slipped out the back door with a small bundle of bread and a canteen of water. She didn't have a plan. She just walked, following the North Star, thinking she could make it to the next town, find work, disappear. A deputy found her at sunrise, her feet blistered, asleep under a mesquite tree not 5 miles from town. He brought her back. Sheriff Bragg didn't yell. He sat her down at the big oak table in his dining room, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. "Disappointing. Ellie," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow that felt more like a weapon than an emotion. "After all we've done for you, the town is talking. They'll think we're mistreating you, that you're ungrateful." He made her feel ashamed, not for wanting freedom, but for embarrassing him. Austin was worse. He was frantic, his eyes wild with a fury she hadn't seen before. "Did you think you could just leave?" he demanded, cornering her in the hall after his father had left. "Where would you go back to, starving in a shack? You belong here. I won't let you go." He grabbed her wrists, his grip like iron bands. "Don't you ever do that again." She tried again 6 months later, a more calculated attempt. She'd saved a few coins and bribed a freight driver to let her hide in the back of his wagon among the crates. She lay there for hours, cramped and praying, the wagon rattling down the road. But it stopped just outside of town limits. The canvas flap was thrown back, and Sheriff Bragg stood there, his face like stone. He'd known, of course he'd known, in Dry Hollow. Everyone reported to the sheriff. This time, the illusion of choice was gone. The back door was bolted at night. Mrs. Gable was instructed to watch her more closely. The cage was no longer gilded. Now she could feel the cold, hard bars. The night it all came to a head was 2 months before the fair. A storm was brewing, the air thick and heavy with the promise of rain that never came. Sheriff Bragg had been called out of town. Austin had been drinking in the saloon since mid-afternoon, and when he came home, he moved with a dangerous, unsteady grace. Ellie was in the kitchen, finishing the last of the dishes. When he came in, he smelled of whiskey and something else, a sour, angry sweat. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her, his eyes dark and hungry. "Leave the dishes, Ellie," he slurred, pushing himself off the frame and walking towards her. She kept her back to him, her hands scrubbing a plate that was already clean. "I'm almost finished, Austin." "I said, leave them." His voice was right behind her ear. He took the plate from her hands and set it down with a loud clatter. He turned her around, his hands gripping her upper arms. "We need to talk about us." "There is no us," she said, her voice trembling but firm. His laugh was ugly. "Isn't there? You live in my house. You eat my food. You wear the clothes I buy you. My father took you in for me. Did you not know that you're my future, Ellie? It's time you started acting like it." He was crowding her, pushing her back against the dry sink. She could feel his hot, whiskey-sour breath on her face. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. "Please, Austin, you're drunk." "I'm clear as a bell," he hissed, his face close to hers. "I'm tired of waiting, tired of you looking at me like I'm dirt. You owe me." He lowered his head, and she turned her face away, a sob catching in her throat. His grip tightened, bruising her arms. He was no longer the charming, smooth-tongued son of the sheriff. He was a brute, his entitlement stripped bare. "Stop," she whispered, tears finally breaking free, tracing cold paths down her cheeks. And then, a voice from the doorway, quiet and cold as river stone. "She told you to stop." They both froze. Cody Lane stood there. He wasn't framed in light like the sheriff had been. He was a figure of shadows, seeming to draw the darkness of the alley in with him. He held a repaired bridle in one hand, the leather gleaming. He must have been on his way to drop it off at the stables next door. He must have heard. Austin spun around, his drunken rage finding a new target. Lane. What the hell are you doing on my property? Get out, you horse-thieving trash! Cody didn't move. He let the insult pass over him as if it were a breeze. His eyes were not on Austin. They were on Ellie. A quick, questioning look. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. He understood. His gaze shifted back to Austin, flat and unyielding. Let her go, Bragg. You've got no business here, Austin spat, though he did loosen his grip on Ellie's arm slightly. She's with me. We were just talking. Looked like more than talk, Cody said. His voice still low, but it cut through the thick air of the kitchen. He took one step into the room. He didn't hurry. He moved with the patience of a man who understood the desert, who knew how to wait. The sight of this silent, unimpressed man seemed to enrage Austin more than any threat could have. He was used to people cowering. You think you can tell me what to do? In my own house, my father will have you run out of this territory on a rail. Maybe, Cody acknowledged, his eyes never wavering. But right now, your father isn't here, and you're hurting the lady. Austin looked from Cody's steady gaze back to Ellie's terrified face, and something in his drunken mind seemed to realize he was losing. He was used to being in control, and this quiet cowboy had stolen it from him without raising his voice or his hand. With a snarl of disgust, he shoved Ellie away from him. She stumbled back, hitting the sink hard. Fine, Austin spat at Cody. Take the little stray. She's not worth the trouble. He pointed a trembling finger at Cody. But you stay away from her. And you stay away from me. This isn't over. He stormed out of the kitchen, his boots loud on the wooden floors. The room was suddenly immensely quiet. Ellie stood trembling, wrapping her arms around herself. Cody remained in the doorway, a silent guardian. He didn't come closer. He didn't offer comforting words. He just waited, giving her space to breathe. After a long moment, she managed to find her voice. Thank you. He gave a short, single nod. You all right, ma'am? Yes, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was true. He looked at her for a second longer, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Then, without another word, he backed out of the doorway, melting into the night as quietly as he had appeared. He left the repaired bridle hanging on a hook by the door. A horse nickered in the distance. The wind picked up, rattling the window pane. Ellie stood alone in the kitchen, the phantom pressure of Austin's fingers still on her arms. But for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. Someone had seen her. Someone had stood for her. Not out of charity, not to claim her, but simply because she had needed help. A man the town called a thief had shown her more decency than the lawman's son ever had. The memory faded, replaced by the real-time rhythm of the horse beneath her, the solid presence of Cody's back against her cheek. This ride was not an escape attempt born of panicked desperation. It was a choice. Her hand on his at the fair had not been a plea for rescue. It was an answer to the question his silent actions had asked in the kitchen that night. Are you ready to be free? Yes, she thought, as the last light of day vanished and the first stars appeared in the vast, darkening sky. Yes. They rode in silence for the first hour, leaving the faint sounds of the fair's fiddles and the angry shouts that had erupted behind them to be swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The sky bled from orange to a deep, star-pricked indigo. A cool wind rose, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass. Ellie held on to Cody, her initial, defiant grip softening into a weary hold. The enormity of what she had done was beginning to settle in, a weight that was equal parts terrifying and liberating. She had walked away from the only security she had, however false it was, and placed her future in the hands of a man she barely knew, a man the whole of Dry Hollow had branded a pariah. She knew the story. Everyone did. It was told on front porches and over the counter at the general store, another piece of local lore that burnished the legend of Sheriff Bragg. 2 years ago, the Miller family, who owned the biggest ranch in the county, had 3 of their best horses stolen in the dead of night. The tracks led out towards the Badlands. Sheriff Bragg, ever the diligent lawman, formed a posse. But it was Bragg himself who found Cody Lane 2 days later, not with the horses, but camped near a watering hole on the trail the thieves had taken. He had a lame mare with him and was mending his saddle. They'd brought him back to Dry Hollow in chains. Austin Bragg had stood on the saloon steps, watching the procession, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. The whole town had come out to see the captured thief. Ellie remembered the sight of him, dusty and silent, his wrists bound, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the jeering faces. He didn't look guilty. He looked removed, as if he were an observer to his own humiliation. Sheriff Bragg had held him in the town's lone jail cell for a week. He questioned him, threatened him, but Cody's story never changed. He said he'd bought the mare from a traveler, that he was just passing through when his own saddle cinch broke. He'd seen the tracks of the stolen horses, but he hadn't made them. There was no proof. The Miller horses were never found, and Bragg couldn't find anyone who had seen Cody near the ranch. Eventually, with no evidence to hold him on, the sheriff had to let him go. But the verdict had already been passed in the court of public opinion. Bragg had released him with a loud, public warning to stay clear of honest folks' property. From that day on, Cody Lane was a marked man. People said the sheriff let him go because he knew Cody was just a hired hand for a bigger ring of rustlers and hoped he would lead them to the rest. Others said he was just too clever, that he'd hidden the horses so well no one would ever find them. No one considered that he might be innocent. Guilt was a brand that was easier to press on an outsider than innocence was to prove. Cody didn't leave the territory as Bragg had warned. Instead, he did the most defiant thing imaginable. He stayed. He moved into an old, abandoned dugout shelter carved into the side of a red rock mesa a few miles from town. It was a place most people avoided, rumored to be haunted by the spirits of prospectors who had died of thirst. There, he kept to himself. He raised a few tough, wiry mustangs, selling them to the occasional traveler or rancher who valued quality over reputation. And he did leather work. His skill with a needle and awl was undeniable. Men who publicly called him a thief would quietly bring him their torn saddles and broken bridles to be mended under the cover of dusk, paying him and leaving without a word. He was a ghost in the life of the town, visible only when necessary. But Ellie had noticed more. She'd seen him, on a bitter winter's day, help old man Fitzwilliam pull his wood cart out of a muddy ditch when it had lost a wheel, working in silence and then disappearing before thanks could be properly given. And she remembered with perfect clarity the day she'd seen a group of boys throwing rocks at a stray dog with a torn ear. Cody had been riding past. He didn't shout at the boys. He just dismounted, his presence alone enough to make them scatter. He knelt by the terrified animal, not reaching for it at first, just letting it see he meant no harm. He'd unwrapped a piece of jerky from his saddlebag and tossed it on the ground. Then, slowly, carefully, he'd taken a clean rag and wiped the blood from the dog's ear before riding on. He was a man of quiet actions in a world of loud, empty words, and one of those actions had saved her. The stallion picked its way up a narrow, rocky trail, and the air grew cooler. The lights of Dry Hollow were long gone. Out here, the only law was the land itself, and Cody moved through it with the easy confidence of a man who was at home. He knew its secrets, where to find water, how to read the stars that glittered like spilled diamonds in the blackness above. Ellie felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. Austin, with his fine horse and tailored suit, would be lost out here in an hour. He knew how to command people, but he didn't know the first thing about commanding himself in a world that didn't bend to his father's name. Cody was the opposite. He was an island, self-sufficient and solid. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he slowed the horse. They rounded a massive boulder, and a small, sheltered clearing opened up before them, nestled against the sheer face of the mesa. A small, sturdy corral made of juniper branches held 3 horses, who nickered softly at their approach, and built right into the rock face was his home. It was a dugout, its front wall made of neatly stacked stone and adobe, with a solid wooden door and a single, small window from which a faint, warm light glowed. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. It was a humble, lonely place. Yet there was a sense of profound peace about it. It was a home built, not bought, earned, not inherited. A scruffy yellow dog with a distinctively torn left ear came bounding out, not barking but whining with excitement and wagging its tail furiously. It was the same dog from town. It jumped up, putting its paws gently on Cody's leg. He dismounted, and for the first time, Ellie saw a hint of a smile touch the corners of his mouth as he scratched the dog behind its good ear. "Easy now. Rip," he murmured. He turned and held up his hands to help her down. His grip was strong and impersonal, steadying her as her stiff legs found the ground. She felt small and out of place in the quiet order of his world. Without a word, he set about his tasks. He unsaddled the stallion, rubbing it down with a care that was almost tender. He checked its hooves, gave it fresh water and a measure of oats. The dog, Rip, sat at his heels, watching his every move with adoration. Ellie stood by the small, crackling fire pit near the entrance to the dugout, unsure of what to do. At the Bragg house, her hands were always busy with some prescribed chore. Here, there was no one to give her orders. The freedom was dizzying. Cody finished with the horses and came over to the fire. He took a dented tin coffee pot from a hook, filled it with water from a barrel, added a scoop of coffee grounds, and set it on the grate over the flames. He moved with an unhurried grace, every action having a clear purpose. He didn't seem burdened by her presence, nor did he seem particularly curious. He just accepted it, like he accepted the wind and the stars. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes assessing in the firelight. "Are you hungry?" he asked. His voice was raspy from disuse. She shook her head, though her stomach was a tight knot of hunger and nerves. "No, thank you." He nodded, accepting her answer without question. He took 2 tin cups from a pack and waited for the coffee to boil. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the soft shuffling of the horses in the corral. It wasn't an awkward silence, not like the tense silences at the Braggs' dinner table. It was a natural, earthy quiet, but it was a quiet that needed to be filled with truth. She had made a choice, and the man who was the center of that choice deserved to know why. He poured the steaming black coffee into the 2 cups. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. The warmth of the cup seeped into her cold hands. She took a sip. It was strong and bitter, but it was real. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. He was watching the fire, his face stoic, the flames carving shadows and light into the angular planes of his cheeks. He seemed 1,000 miles away. She had to bring him back. "I couldn't stay there," she said, her voice small, almost carried away by the wind. He didn't look at her, but she knew he was listening. He gave a slight nod. "Sheriff Bragg, he calls it charity, taking me in." She paused, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. But it wasn't a home. It was just a place to be kept, a debt to be paid. She set her cup down on a flat rock, her hands trembling now. The whole story, the whole year of suffocation and fear, was welling up inside her, demanding to be spoken. "Austin, he thinks he owns me, that I was brought there for him. And everyone, the whole town, they just smiled and nodded and let it happen." She finally looked away from him, at the dark, vast emptiness that surrounded them. It was the same emptiness that had been inside her for so long. "I ran away, twice. They always brought me back." Her voice cracked on the last words. She took a shaky breath and looked at him again. This was the heart of it, the truth she hadn't even fully admitted to herself until this very moment. "I don't belong to the Braggs," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "But I also don't know where I belong." She had laid her broken pieces at his feet. She was an orphan, a runaway, A penniless girl with a powerful enemy. She had nothing to offer, nothing to give. She half expected him to tell her to leave, to take her back in the morning, to say he couldn't afford the trouble she would bring. Sheriff Bragg would not let this go. His pride, and Austin's, had been wounded in front of the entire town. They would come for her. Cody was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if the answers were written in the flames. The dog, Rip, rested his head on Cody's knee, and Cody's hand absently stroked his torn ear. Finally, he looked up, his gaze meeting hers directly. There was no pity in his eyes, only a calm, quiet gravity. "No one belongs out here," he said, his voice low and even. "We're just passing through, trying to find a piece of ground that will hold us for a while." He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks up into the night sky. "You don't have to belong to anything," he continued, looking back at her. "Here, you just are, and that's enough." He offered no promises of safety, no declarations of protection. He didn't tell her everything would be all right. He offered her something far more valuable, something she hadn't had since her father died. He offered her a place where she could simply exist, without expectation, without debt, without belonging to anyone but herself. Ellie picked up her cup and held it in both hands, the warmth a small anchor in the vastness of the night. For the first time, the terrifying emptiness of the land around her didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a possibility. A clean slate, a place to begin. Sleep did not come. Ellie lay on a bedroll Cody had laid out for her near the fire, the rough wool blanket pulled up to her chin. The flames had died down to glowing embers, and the stars overhead were a cold, indifferent audience. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching horses. Every shadow cast by the mesa seemed to hold the shape of a man. She had made her stand, but the consequences were now galloping towards them in the dark. She was no longer just an ungrateful ward. She was a runaway, a stolen piece of property in the eyes of the most powerful man in the territory. She heard a soft scrape of leather and opened her eyes. Cody was already moving in the pre-dawn gloom. He hadn't been sleeping either. He was checking the cinches on two of the other horses in his corral, a sturdy buckskin and a smaller, nimble-looking sorrel mare. He moved without wasted motion, his hands knowing their work in the dark. He was not preparing for a new day. He was preparing for a flight. Ellie sat up, the blanket falling away. The dog, Rip, who had been sleeping at her feet, lifted his head and thumped his tail once against the hard-packed earth. Cody didn't look over, but he knew she was awake. "We can't stay," he said, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the silence. "He'll have a posse organized by sunrise, not an official one, just him, his boy, and a few men who get paid well to not ask questions." Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. "Where will we go?" "South," he said, moving to his dugout and emerging a moment later with 2 full canteens and a canvas sack. "Across the flats, the terrain is harder, but it's open. We'll see them coming. Then we head for the canyons near the old boundary line. It's rough country, easy to lose a trail, or a man." He tossed the sack to her. It was heavier than it looked. "Jerky and hardtack. It's all I've got." She clutched the sack. It was real. This was happening. She scrambled to her feet, folding the bedroll with clumsy, cold fingers. He was already leading the 2 fresh horses out of the corral. He saddled them with swift efficiency, tying the bedroll and the sack of food behind the sorrel's saddle. Rip whined softly, sensing the departure, and nudged his head against Cody's hand. Cody paused, his unflappable calm breaking for just a second. He knelt and scrubbed the dog's head, murmuring something too low for her to hear. He stood up and looked at the dugout, at the small, ordered world he had carved out for himself. He was leaving it all behind. For her, the weight of that sacrifice settled on her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she whispered as he helped her mount the sorrel mare. "I've brought you nothing but trouble." He finished tightening his own saddle on the buckskin and looked at her, his face unreadable in the gray light. "Trouble finds a man one way or another," he said, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. "Might as well be for a good reason." He swung into his saddle, and with a soft click of his tongue, they moved out, leaving the sleeping dog and the smoking embers of the fire behind. They rode away from the mesa, two small figures swallowed by the immense, silent desert. The sun rose hours later, a merciless white eye in a pale sky. It baked the ground, turning the air into a shimmering haze. They were deep in the flats now, a seemingly endless expanse of cracked earth, greasewood, and skeletal-looking cholla cactus. The world was a panorama of brown and gray. Cody set a hard, steady pace, never pushing the horses to a gallop but always moving, always eating up the miles. Ellie's body ached. She was not used to riding like this. Her muscles screamed, and the sun beat down on her head. But she didn't complain. She watched Cody's back, a straight, unyielding line against the horizon. He rode as if he were part of the horse, a man perfectly at home in this harsh, unforgiving world. He would occasionally scan the horizon behind them, his eyes narrowed against the glare. It was in the late morning that he finally saw it. He reined in his horse, holding up a hand. Ellie stopped beside him. "What is it?" she asked, her throat dry. He didn't answer immediately. He just stared back the way they had come. She followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing but the heat haze. Then, she saw it, a faint, brownish smudge against the perfect blue of the sky, a smudge that was growing. "Dust," he said, his voice flat. "3 riders, moving fast." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the heat. Austin, he had found them. "They have better horses," Cody stated, not with fear, but with a detached, professional assessment. "Fresher, they'll catch us if we stay in the open." He turned his horse, heading southeast. "This way. There's a wash that leads into the foothills. We can make better time in the soft sand, and it'll hide our tracks for a while." The flight became a desperate, lung-burning race. They urged the horses faster, the steady trot breaking into a canter. The fine sand of the dry riverbed flew up around them. The sun was a hammer, and every breath was a gasp of hot, dusty air. Ellie clung to the saddle horn. Her world narrowed to the pounding of hooves, the straining muscles of her horse, and the determined figure of Cody Lane riding just ahead of her. She looked back once. The dust cloud was bigger, closer. She could almost imagine Austin's face, contorted with rage and wounded pride. He wasn't chasing a runaway. He was hunting a possession that had dared to have a will of its own. They rode for what felt like hours, the wash twisting and turning, the rocky sides growing higher around them. Cody finally slowed, guiding them into a narrow fissure in the rock wall, a space barely wide enough for the horses to pass through. It opened into a small, hidden box canyon, a dead end of sheer rock walls and scattered boulders. It was a trap, if they were found, but it was also a place to hide. He dismounted, his movements urgent but controlled. "Get down," he said, his voice low, "and keep quiet." He took the reins of both horses and led them deeper into the shadows, behind a massive rockfall that hid them from the entrance. He put a hand on each of their muzzles, calming them, keeping them silent. Ellie pressed herself against the cold rock, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The air in the canyon was still and close. The silence was absolute. And then she heard it, the sound of approaching horses, their hooves muffled by the sand of the wash. The sound grew louder, closer, then voices, echoing and distorted by the rock walls. "Damn tracks just disappear." It was an unfamiliar voice, rough and angry. And then Austin's, higher, tighter, laced with fury. "She's with him! The thief! They have to be in one of these canyons! Spread out! Jed, You take the South Fork. Silas, you're with me. $500 to the man who puts a bullet in Lane's leg. I want him alive. Her, too." Ellie squeezed her eyes shut. He wanted Cody crippled. He wanted her back. A cold dread washed over her, colder than the rock at her back. The hoofbeats faded as two of the riders, presumably Austin and Silas, continued up the main wash, but one set of hoofbeats grew louder again. "Jed, he was coming back, checking the side canyons." Ellie held her breath. The sound was agonizingly slow. A hoof scraped on rock, right outside the narrow entrance to their hiding place. She could hear the man muttering to himself, the creak of his saddle leather. It felt as if he were standing right beside her. Cody stood perfectly still, a statue carved from shadow, his hand still resting on the buckskin's nose. He had drawn his pistol, the dark metal looking cool and deadly in the gloom. He didn't look scared. He looked ready. The hoofbeats paused. A long, terrible silence stretched, where the only sound was the blood roaring in Ellie's ears. Then, with a curse, the man moved on. The sound of his horse receded down the wash. Ellie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her body trembling with relief. Cody waited another full minute before he relaxed, holstering his pistol. "They'll be back," he whispered. "They'll search every one of these canyons on their way down." He looked up at the sky, a narrow sliver of blue visible between the high canyon walls. His expression changed. He was no longer looking for pursuers. He was reading the air, the light. "The wind's changing," he said. Ellie hadn't noticed, but now she could feel it. The still, hot air had begun to stir. A low moaning sound started, a whisper that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. The sliver of sky above was no longer blue, but a sickly, yellowish gray. "Storm's coming," Cody said, his voice grim. "A bad one. We need better shelter." He moved quickly, leading the horses further back, wedging them into a tight space between two massive boulders. He pulled the saddlebags off, grabbing the canteens and the sack of food. "Stay here," he commanded, and began to search the base of the canyon wall, running his hands over the rock. The wind was a physical force now, howling down the canyon, whipping sand and grit into the air. The sky had turned a dark, churning brown. It was like the world was ending. The fine dust became a barrage of stinging sand. Ellie shielded her face with her arm, coughing as the grit filled her mouth and nose. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The roar of the wind was deafening, a solid wall of sound that vibrated through the rock. "Here!" Cody's voice was a faint shout, almost lost in the gale. He was 20 feet away, pressed against the canyon wall. He had found a small alcove, a hollow in the rock barely big enough for one person to crouch in. He beckoned to her frantically. Ellie stumbled towards him, blinded by the sand, the wind trying to tear her off her feet. She fell to her knees, disoriented. A strong hand grabbed her arm and hauled her forward. Cody shoved her into the small space, pushing her down until she was curled in a tight ball against the back of the alcove. The rock offered some shelter, but the wind still tore at them, trying to pull them out into the maelstrom. The sand was like 1,000 tiny needles, finding every inch of exposed skin. Before Ellie could even register what was happening, Cody was there, covering her. He didn't get into the alcove with her. There wasn't room. Instead, he pressed himself against the opening, his body becoming a human shield. His broad back and shoulders took the full, brutal force of the storm, blocking the wind and the flying sand. He wedged his boots against a rock for leverage and leaned in, his arms braced against the wall on either side of her. The world outside was a roaring, brown chaos, but Ellie's world had become this small, dark space. All she could feel was the solid, unmoving weight of Cody's body pinning her in place. All she could hear, beneath the scream of the wind, was the sound of his ragged breathing close to her ear and the dull thud of rocks and debris hitting his back. He grunted with some of the larger impacts but didn't move. He was a wall, a shield, protecting her. Time ceased to have meaning. It was just the storm and the man, an eternity of wind and warmth and pressure. She was terrified, but deep within the terror, a strange and profound sense of safety took root. She was hidden from the storm. She was hidden from Austin, in the heart of the most violent and chaotic moment of her life. She was being protected by a quiet, outcast cowboy who owed her nothing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the roar of the wind began to lessen. The barrage of sand softened. After what felt like a lifetime, the howl became a moan, then a whisper, and then silence. The sudden quiet was as shocking as the noise had been. Cody didn't move for a long moment. Then, with a groan, he slowly, stiffly pushed himself away from the rock. He stood, and for the first time turned to face her. He looked like a man made of dust. His hair, his clothes, his skin were all caked in a thick layer of fine, red sand. A thin trickle of blood ran from a cut on his cheek where a rock must have struck him. He was breathing heavily, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He looked at her, still curled in the alcove. His gray eyes were clear of everything but a deep, bone-weary fatigue. He had just endured a hellish assault from the elements to keep her safe. Ellie slowly uncurled herself, her limbs stiff and sore. She looked from his battered face to the transformed canyon, now blanketed in a smooth, eerie layer of fresh sand. The storm had erased everything, their tracks, their pursuers' tracks, the entire world as it had been. It had given them a clean slate. She stood up, her legs shaky. She was covered in dust, but she was unharmed. He had taken it all. He had stood between her and the storm. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She looked at this man, this stranger who had upended his life and nearly been flayed alive for her, and he had never once asked her for an explanation. Her voice, when she spoke, was a raw, trembling whisper, barely audible in the profound silence. "I didn't ask you to save me," she said, looking into his tired, steady eyes. "But I thank you for not asking why." The silence after the sandstorm was a physical presence, a heavy blanket over the world. The air was clean, washed of dust, and the sky was a bruised, tender purple at the edges of the horizon. The new landscape of smooth, sculpted sand was beautiful and alien. Their pursuers were gone, their tracks wiped from existence. But the sense of danger lingered, a cold spot in the air. They moved cautiously, walking the horses for the first hour to conserve their energy. Their only sounds the soft crunch of sand under hooves and the creak of saddle leather. It was Jed who found them. He must have been separated from Austin in the storm and was trying to backtrack when he crested a dune and saw them below. There was no warning, just the sharp crack of a rifle shot that echoed flatly in the still air, followed by the whine of a bullet ricocheting off the rock face near Ellie's head. Cody reacted instantly. "Ride!" he yelled, his voice a raw command. He slapped the rump of Ellie's sorrel, sending it lunging forward. He spurred his own horse, turning in the saddle and firing his pistol back towards the dune, not to hit, but to make their pursuer take cover. Another shot answered him. Ellie felt a searing heat pass by her shoulder, and she saw Cody flinch violently in his saddle, a dark stain blossoming on the sleeve of his shirt just below the shoulder. He didn't cry out. He just leaned lower over his horse's neck and urged it on, leading her into a maze of rock formations that rose like skeletal fingers from the desert floor. They galloped, the horse's lungs burning, twisting through narrow passages, their hoofbeats a frantic prayer for escape. Cody seemed to know the terrain instinctively, his sense of direction unerring even in the chaos. He didn't look back again until they had put at least a mile of solid rock between them and the lone rifleman. He finally slowed them to a walk in a deep, shadowed ravine. Ellie drew up beside him, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. Her eyes were fixed on the dark, wet patch on his arm. "You're hurt," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "It's a graze," he said, his voice tight with pain he refused to show. Just a scratch, but we can't stop. He knows our direction now." They rode on, pushing deeper into the Badlands. The sun set and a cold moon rose, silvering the edges of the rock. Cody was swaying slightly in the saddle now, his silence deeper, heavier. He was losing blood. Ellie knew that a scratch in this country, if not properly tended, could be a death sentence. It was well after midnight when they found it, a ghost against the skyline, the skeletal frame of a water tower. Its wooden tank, long since dried and splintered, stood beside a squat, stone pump house, a railway line, its steel tracks rusted and half buried in sand, stretched away into the darkness in either direction. It was an old, abandoned water stop from a line the railroad had given up on years ago, a place of ghosts and forgotten purpose. It was perfect. Cody slid from his saddle, his legs nearly buckling. "We'll rest here," he breathed, leaning against his horse for a moment. Ellie was off her mare in an instant, her exhaustion forgotten in a rush of adrenaline. She helped him lead the horses into the pump house, the heavy wooden door groaning open into a space that smelled of rust, old oil, and time. Inside, a massive, silent iron pump and boiler stood like ancient gods in the moonlight that streamed through the grimy windows. "The wound," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Let me see it." He didn't protest. He sank down onto an old wooden crate, his face pale in the gloom. With gentle, careful fingers, Ellie tore away the sleeve of his shirt. The bullet hadn't been a clean graze. It had plowed a shallow furrow through the muscle of his shoulder, leaving a raw, angry-looking wound that was still sluggishly weeping blood. The fabric of his shirt was stuck to it in places. Her stomach turned, but she pushed the feeling down. Her father had taught her some basic field medicine, lessons learned from a life of small injuries and no doctors. She found a clean rag in her small bundle of possessions, then took one of their canteens. "This will hurt," she said softly. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes closed. She poured the precious water over the wound, cleaning away the blood and grit as gently as she could. He hissed in a sharp breath through his teeth but made no other sound. She cleaned it meticulously, picking out the threads of his shirt with the tip of her finger. When it was as clean as she could get it, she tore the rest of the rag into strips and bound the wound tightly, the bandage a stark white slash against his tanned skin in the darkness. Her hands were shaking when she finished. He opened his eyes and looked at her, his gaze clear and direct. "Thank you," he said. It was more than just thanks for the bandage. It was an acknowledgement of her strength, her capability. In the days that followed, the abandoned water station became their world. It was a sanctuary of silence and slow healing. The threat of pursuit was ever present, a shadow in the back of their minds. But out here, in this forgotten place, they could almost believe they were the only two people left on Earth. Ellie fell into a routine dictated by survival. In the mornings, she would scout the immediate area for water seeps or edible plants, never straying far. In the afternoons, she would tend to Cody's wound, cleaning and redressing it. His fever, which had flared on the second day, finally broke on the third, leaving him weak but clear-headed. It was during this time that she began to learn his language. It was a language without words, spoken in the quiet spaces between actions. She learned that the slight narrowing of his eyes meant he'd heard a sound on the wind that she had missed. She learned that the way he tested the heft of their dwindling bag of jerky told her more about their precarious situation than any spoken warning could. Language, she realized, was in the way he would always take the first watch of the night, sitting with his back to the stone wall of the pump house, his pistol resting on his knee, so she could sleep without fear. It was in the way he divided their meager rations. He would break the hardtack biscuit, and his piece was always, almost imperceptibly, smaller than hers. He never commented on it. He would just hand her the portion and start eating his own. One afternoon, while he was resting, she found a small, rusted tin of axle grease in a corner of the pump house. Without a word, She spent the next hour cleaning and oiling his pistol, which had become gritty with sand from the storm. She disassembled it, cleaned each part with a piece of her own petticoat, oiled it, and put it back together with the careful precision her father had taught her. When he woke, she handed it to him. He took it, checked the action, which now moved with a smooth, deadly click, and looked at her. He didn't say thank you this time. He just gave her a long, searching look that held more gratitude than a whole speech. In that look, she understood that he saw her not as a burden, but as a partner. His silence was not empty. It was a deep well of observation. He would sit for an hour just watching the sky, and she came to understand he wasn't daydreaming. He was reading the clouds, the flight of a distant hawk, the direction of the wind, before they settled for the night. He would always stand outside the pump house door and look at the sky, a silent communion with the world. It wasn't a prayer. It was a practical assessment of the night to come, a calculation of their chances. His stillness was a sign of his deep connection to the land, a connection that men like Austin Bragg, with all their noise and bluster, could never comprehend. Ellie found herself growing comfortable in the quiet. At the Bragg house, silence had been a weapon, a tool of disapproval. Conversations were full of hidden meanings and unspoken demands. Here, silence was a shared space, a form of mutual respect. There were no questions about her past beyond what she had already offered, no demands for her future. There was only the present moment, the shared task of surviving another day. On the fifth night, his shoulder was visibly better, the angry red of the wound fading to a healing pink. But their food was almost gone. The horses were grazing on sparse, dry grass that wouldn't sustain them for much longer. The sanctuary was becoming a trap. They would have to move soon. The moon was a thin sliver, and the stars were fiercely bright. They sat by a small, smokeless fire she had built from dried creosote bush inside the pump house. The door cracked just enough to let the air in without showing a light. Cody had been staring into the flames, his face thoughtful. He seemed to have come to a decision. He reached into his boot and pulled out a small, leather-sheathed dagger. It was not a fancy weapon. The handle was smooth, dark wood, worn from use, and the blade, when he drew it, was clean and sharp. The steel caught the firelight. He held it out to her, handle first. She looked from the knife to his face, confused. "Take it," he said, his voice a low rumble. She took it hesitantly. The knife had a surprising weight, a solid, deadly feel in her hand. He looked at her, his gray eyes serious, holding no trace of fear, only a stark, brutal honesty. "We leave before dawn," he said. "Austin, or what's left of his men, won't have given up. They'll be looking. The next few days will be the hardest. If we get separated, or if I don't wake up." He let the words hang in the air. He was talking about his own death as calmly as he talked about the weather. He was giving her the truth, unvarnished and hard. "If I don't wake up," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "You don't wait. You take the sorrel. She's faster. You ride south. Don't stop until you cross the territorial line. Don't look back." Ellie stared at him, the knife feeling cold and heavy in her palm. He was entrusting her not just with a weapon, but with his own pragmatism. He was telling her that her survival was more important than sentiment. It was the hardest, most honest, and most respectful thing anyone had ever said to her. He wasn't telling her he would die for her. He was telling her that if he died, she had to live. He saw her as a survivor, not a victim. A year ago, she might have cried, she might have protested, but the girl who had cried in the Bragg's kitchen was gone. The desert and this quiet, steady man had burned that weakness out of her. She looked down at the dagger in her hand, then back up at him. She gave him a single, sharp nod. She didn't need to speak. He had taught her his language. And in the quiet of the abandoned pump house, he understood her answer perfectly. She slid the dagger into the waistband of her skirt. the cool metal a stark and comforting presence against her skin. It was a promise. She would go on. They left before the first hint of dawn. Two ghosts moving through a landscape of pale, moon-washed rock. The horses were rested, and Cody's shoulder, though stiff, allowed him to ride without visible pain. They traveled a hard, circuitous route, sticking to rocky ground where the horses would leave little sign, avoiding the open spaces. The dagger Cody had given Ellie was a cold, reassuring weight against her hip. It was a symbol of the brutal honesty that now existed between them. There were no false comforts, only the shared will to survive. Their supplies were dangerously low. By the second day, they were down to a handful of jerky and the last of the hardtack. The canteens were half empty. Cody pushed them onward, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain, looking for a sign, for a place that felt right. It was late in the afternoon when he found it. Tucked into a fold of the hills was a line of green, a thin, almost impossible ribbon of life following a dry creek bed. Cottonwood trees, their leaves a shivering gold, meant there was water close to the surface. "We'll make camp here," he said, his voice rough with thirst. "We can rest the horses for a day, dig for water." It was a small oasis of hope in the vastness of the wasteland, while Cody saw to the horses, letting them graze on the sparse but welcome grass. Ellie took on the task of mending. The hard ride had taken its toll on their gear. A strap on her saddlebag was frayed, and the corner of Cody's own bag had been torn on a sharp piece of rock. She sat under the shade of a cottonwood, the familiar, methodical work of needle and thread, a calming rhythm for her frayed nerves. She emptied his saddlebag to get a clean angle on the tear. Inside was the usual assortment of a man who lived on the move, a whetstone, a spare box of cartridges, a small tin of tobacco, a length of rope, tucked deep in the lining. So far down her fingers brushed against the leather seam, she felt a small, flat packet. Curious, she worked it free. It was a folded piece of oilskin, tied securely with a leather thong. It was clearly something meant to be protected from the elements. Something important. For a moment, she hesitated. This was his private world, a place she had no right to enter. But the journey they were on had stripped away the polite boundaries of the world she had left behind. Their lives were intertwined now, their survival a shared burden. His secrets, she reasoned, might be as vital to that survival as food and water. Her fingers, stained with dust and grit, worked at the knot. Inside the oilskin were several sheets of cheap, folded paper, covered in a tight, controlled script. It was a letter. The ink was faded in places, and the pages were worn soft at the creases, as if they had been read and reread many times. It was not addressed to anyone, and it wasn't signed. But it was Cody's hand. She knew it instinctively. She began to read. "It has been a year since they put the brand on me. It doesn't burn the skin, but I feel it all the same. Every time I walk into town for supplies. Every time a man looks at my horses and then looks at me and decides to walk away. They call me the thief." Bragg let go. They don't know the truth. They don't want to. The story they have is simpler. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes flew across the page, devouring the words. It was Austin. Of course it was Austin. He and two of his father's hired guns, Silas and Jed. I was tracking a wild mare near the Miller place when I saw them. They were running 3 of Miller's best horses, running them hard, their mouths foaming. It wasn't a quiet theft in the night. It was an act of arrogance, like a game to them. I saw Austin's face in the moonlight. He was laughing. I should have turned back. I should have ridden away and forgotten what I saw. But something in me, some fool part, wouldn't let it be. I followed at a distance. They made camp by the Crow Creek. I thought, I don't know what I thought, that I could get the horses back, maybe, that I could do the right thing. They found me before I could make a move. I was careless. Austin walked into my camp with a pistol in his hand, Silas and Jed behind him. There was no surprise on his face, only a kind of cruel amusement. He knew who I was. just a drifter, mending my own tack, a nobody. "Looks like we found our horse thief," he said. And he smiled. It was the smile of a man who has never been told no, who holds all the cards. I told him I saw what he did. I told him I'd tell his father. He laughed right in my face. "You do that," he said. "You ride into town and tell my father that his only son is a common rustler, and I'll tell him I caught you red-handed with the Miller horses, that you pulled a gun on me, and that I had to shoot you down to defend myself. Now, who do you think he's going to believe?" The paper trembled in Ellie's hands. She could see it. She could see Austin's smug, untouchable face, hear the contempt in his voice. She could feel the cold, suffocating certainty of his power. He was right, and we both knew it. It was my word against his, a drifter against the son of the law. I had no proof, no witnesses but the two men who worked for him. If I fought, I would die, out there in the dark, with no one to see. He would have put a bullet in me, and my body would have been proof of his story. The town would have called him a hero. So I stayed quiet. He told me he was going to teach me a lesson about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He and his men took my gun, took my horse, and left me there on foot. They told me if I ever spoke a word of what I saw, they would find me and finish the job. The next day, the sheriff's posse found me, just where Austin told them I'd be. The story was already written. All I had to do was play my part. I chose to live. I took the shame in the name they gave me because it was the only choice they left me. Sometimes I wonder if it was the right one, to live as a coward, or to die with the truth in your throat. Out here, the answer changes with the direction of the wind. Ellie finished the last page, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. The whole story, the whole ugly truth, lay bare in the faded ink. It wasn't just a frame-up. It was a calculated act of cruelty, a display of absolute power by a boy who knew his father's star would protect him from anything. Cody hadn't been a suspect. He had been a convenience, an answer to a problem Austin himself had created. The quiet, solitary man she knew was not quiet by nature. He had been silenced. His reputation hadn't just been tarnished. It had been murdered, and he had been forced to stand by and watch it happen, because the alternative was his own death. She carefully folded the letter, slipped it back into its oilskin sheath, and placed it on the ground. She looked over at Cody. He was on his knees by the dry creek bed, digging methodically with his hands and the knife she had returned to him, searching for the water table. His back was to her, the set of his shoulders, the steady, patient movement of his work. It all looked different now. She was no longer looking at a man with a shadowed past. She was looking at a man who had been unjustly condemned, a man who had chosen a lonely, hard life over a certain death. Her own story suddenly felt small and pale in comparison. She had been trapped by obligation and fear, but he had been trapped by a system so corrupt that the truth itself was a death sentence. And yet, he had saved her. He had seen her desperation in the Bragg's kitchen, had seen her public defiance at the fair, and he had ridden into trouble with her without a moment's hesitation. He, who had every reason to hate the name Bragg and anyone associated with it, had chosen to help her. She had to know why. She waited until dusk. They had found water, a small, muddy trickle, but enough to fill their canteens and water the horses. They had shared the last of the jerky. A small fire burned between them, pushing back the immense, dark loneliness of the landscape. Cody was sharpening his knife on the whetstone, the rhythmic shh, the only sound in the quiet air. Ellie watched the firelight play on his focused, unreadable face. "Cody," she said, her voice soft but clear. He paused, the knife still against the stone. He looked up at her, his gray eyes questioning in the gloom. "I found your letter," she said simply. There was no other way to say it. "In your saddlebag, when I was mending it." His face went perfectly still. The muscles in his jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. He didn't look angry or surprised. He just looked weary, as if a truth he had carried alone for years had finally decided to walk out into the light. He set the knife and the stone down carefully. A long silence passed between them, filled only by the crackle of the flames. "Why didn't you fight?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why did you let him do that to you? You could have told everyone the truth." He looked away from her, into the fire. "And who would I have told? Ellie?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of self-pity. "The Sheriff Austin is his blood, his legacy. You think he would have believed me, a man with no name, no land, passing through?" He shook his head slowly. "The town. They believe what the sheriff tells them to believe. The truth wouldn't have set me free. It would have put me in a noose." He picked up a stick and poked at the embers, his movements deliberate. "Out there, that night, there were 3 of them and 1 of me. If I'd tried to be a hero, I would have been a dead hero. Austin would have had his story, his father would have had a dead rustler, and nothing would have changed. They left me only one path that ended with me still breathing. I chose to walk it." His logic was brutal and irrefutable. It was the cold calculus of survival, and she understood it completely. It was the same math she had done in her head every day at the Bragg house. She looked at him, at his profile etched by firelight. She saw the years of loneliness, of quiet injustice that he had carried, and a fierce, protective anger rose in her, an anger on his behalf that he seemed unable to feel for himself. "But you knew," she said, her voice rising with an intensity that surprised her. "You knew who I was, that I was living under their roof. You saw what Austin was, what his father was. You knew helping me would bring them down on you all over again. You had every reason to turn your back, every reason to hate me." She leaned forward, her eyes searching his, demanding an answer. "So why did you do it? Cody, why did you help me?" He finally turned his head and looked at her. His gaze was steady and deep, and in his eyes, she saw not just his past, but her own, reflected in a shared understanding that ran deeper than words. "Because I know what it is to be silenced," he said, his voice a low, rough thing, full of a pain he rarely showed. "To have them take your truth and twist it into something ugly, to be trapped, with no good choices left." He held her gaze, and the distance between them seemed to vanish. "I had to stay quiet back then to survive," he said. "I swallowed their lies because I was alone and had no one to stand for me. But when I saw you in that kitchen, when I saw you at that fair, I saw them doing it all over again to someone else." He paused, the firelight catching the old pain in his eyes. "I couldn't speak for myself then, but I could stand for you now." He looked into her eyes, and his voice dropped to a near whisper, a confession that laid his soul bare. "I did it," he said, "because I couldn't stand to watch them make someone else be silent. 2. Cody's confession by the fire changed the air between them. The truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. It settled in the quiet spaces, filling them not with awkwardness, but with a profound, unspoken understanding. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were 2 people who had seen the hidden, ugly machinery of the world and had been ground down by it in different ways. His silence was no longer a mystery to her, and her desperation was no longer a liability to him. It was a shared language. The immediate threat from Austin and his men had passed, faded into the vast, empty landscape, like a bad dream. The storm and the shootout had bought them time, but the desert itself was a slower, more patient pursuer. Thirst, hunger, and exposure were its weapons. Their small oasis by the creek bed was a temporary reprieve, not a solution. It was Cody who made the decision. "We go back," he said one morning, watching the sunrise. Ellie looked at him, confused. "Back to Dry Hollow?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "To the water station. It's stone. It's defensible. The well might be deep enough to hold real water if we clear it. It's the only place for 100 miles that could pass for a home." It was a risk, Returning to a place they had been before felt like tempting fate, but she saw the logic in his words. Out here, 4 solid walls and the promise of a reliable well were a fortress. She nodded her agreement. The return to the abandoned pump house felt different. It was no longer a desperate hiding place, but a destination. They saw it now not for its decay and loneliness, but for its potential. The stone walls were thick, the rusted iron pump a monument to a sturdier time. This was a place built to withstand the elements. They could, too. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of hard shared labor. They were no longer just surviving. They were building. The work was grueling, but it was honest. Every sore muscle, every scraped knuckle, was a testament to their effort, a small victory against the entropy of the desert. The roof of the pump house was their first task. It was solid slate, but years of neglect had allowed tiles to slip and crack, leaving gaps where the relentless sun and stinging sand could get in. They worked together in a silent, efficient ballet. Ellie would climb onto the lower part of the roof, her smaller frame more nimble, and identify the gaps. Cody, his shoulder now a dull, healing ache instead of a sharp pain, would mix adobe mud and dry grass in a bucket. The same way he'd built his dugout, he would pass the bucket up to her, and she would pack the mixture into the cracks, her fingers deft and sure. They worked for hours under the oppressive sun, sweat stinging their eyes, speaking only when necessary. More mud. Careful, that tile is loose. Their hands became caked with the same earth. Their faces were smudged with the same dirt. They were partners in the truest sense of the word. Their next challenge was the well. It was just outside the pump house, a circular stone opening covered by a rotted wooden lid. When they pried it off, the shaft was dark and deep, but the bottom was choked with a decade's worth of sand, rock, and dead things. The air that rose from it smelled of decay and dust. For a full week, the well became their world. Cody rigged a pulley system using a length of old rope they found and a rusted gear from the pump machinery. He attached a heavy bucket, and the back-breaking work began. He would lower the bucket, his muscles straining as he dug into the debris below. Then Ellie would take the rope, her smaller frame braced against the stone lip of the well, and haul the heavy load of sand and rock to the surface. She would empty it, and he would send it down again. Down and up, the rhythm of their lives measured by a single bucket. Sometimes they found things: a rusted railroad spike, a whiskey bottle, the bleached bones of a coyote. Each object was a small piece of a forgotten story. As they dug deeper, the sand became cooler, then damp. The smell of decay was replaced by a clean, earthy scent. And then, one afternoon, when Cody was at the bottom and Ellie was hauling up a load that seemed impossibly heavy, he called up to her, his voice echoing in the shaft. "Water, Ellie, I've hit water." She pulled the bucket over the edge, her arms screaming with the effort. It was half filled with a thick, muddy sludge, but at the bottom, a few inches of dark, murky water sloshed. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They had done it. They had brought life back to this dead place. That evening, after letting the silt settle, they drank their first cup of clear, cold water from the well. It was sweet on their tongues, a taste of victory, a shared communion. With water secured, food was the next priority. Cody showed her how to make snares from a thin, pliable wire he carried. He didn't just make them for her. He taught her. He showed her how to find the rabbit trails, the small, almost invisible paths they used. He showed her how to tie the slip knot, how to anchor it to a sagebrush so the animal couldn't drag it away. His hands would guide hers, his calloused fingers briefly touching her own, a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. He was teaching her to survive on her own, giving her a skill that was hers to keep. The first time she checked her snares and found a plump jackrabbit, a fierce, primal pride surged through her. She brought it back to the pump house, and the look of quiet approval in Cody's eyes was worth more than any praise Austin had ever given her. In the evenings, with the scent of roasting rabbit filling the small stone house and the day's work done. The walls they had built around their own pasts began to crumble. The shared labor had earned them a shared trust. It was Ellie who spoke first. One night, as she stared into the flames of their small fire, a memory surfaced, soft and gentle. "My mother loved flowers," she said, her voice quiet. "Even in the worst dirt, she could make things grow. She used to say that a flower doesn't care if a man is rich or poor. It just grows if you give it a little water and a reason to stay." Cody said nothing, but he stopped cleaning his knife and gave her his full attention. His listening was an active thing, an invitation. "Encouraged," she continued, the words coming in a slow, hesitant trickle at first, then a steady stream. She told him about her childhood, which had been poor but happy. She spoke of her mother's hands, always busy, always gentle. And then she spoke of her mother's death from pneumonia when Ellie was 16, and how the light had seemed to go out of her father's world, and her own. "That's when the debts got bad," she said, her voice dropping. "My father, he wasn't a bad man, just a dreamer. He made a deal with another dreamer, a man who had a claim a few counties over, a man named Silas Blackwood." She flinched as she said the name. "The deal was for supplies. My father couldn't pay in cash, so he paid with me." She looked at Cody, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "It wasn't like a sale, not like that. It was an arrangement, a marriage, to settle the debt. I was 17. Blackwood was almost 40. She hugged her knees to her chest, the memory a cold weight inside her. "He wasn't a good man. He was kind when people were watching, but when we were alone, his hands were heavy. And his temper was short. He saw me as another one of his claims, something he had bought and paid for." She shuddered. "I stayed for 3 months. Every day. I died a little. One night. He had been drinking. He was angrier than usual. He told me that even a mule knows its master. I knew if I stayed, one day he would bury me on that claim. So I ran," she whispered. "I took a horse and rode all night. I made my way back to my father. When I told him what happened, he broke down. He was a weak man, but he loved me. He swore he would protect me. Blackwood never came for me. We heard he got into a card game and was killed a month later. But I never felt safe. And then the fever took my father. And Sheriff Bragg came. And it felt like it was happening all over again. Another man, another debt, another cage." When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. She had laid the ugliest parts of her life bare. She felt raw and exposed, and waited for him to speak, to judge. Cody didn't move for a long time. Then, he reached across the small space between them and gently, hesitantly, he laid his hand on her shoulder. His touch was not possessive or pitying. It was just a steady, warm pressure, an anchor. "No one's gonna put you in a cage again," he said, his voice a low, certain rumble. "Not while I'm here." It was the closest thing to a promise he had ever made, and in the quiet of the pump house, with the vast, dangerous desert outside, Ellie believed him. A few mornings later, a rare, gentle rain fell, washing the world clean. The shower was brief, but it left the air smelling of wet earth and creosote. Cody had gone out at dawn, scouting their perimeter. When he returned, Ellie was fetching water from the newly cleaned well. He didn't say anything as he passed her to tend to the horses. She finished her task and walked over to her mare, and then she saw it, tucked carefully into the leather cheek strap of the bridle. Right where the horse's soft muzzle would be, was a single, perfect wildflower. It was a desert marigold, a small, defiant burst of brilliant yellow against the dark, worn leather. Its petals were still dotted with tiny, perfect globes of rainwater. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She knew, with absolute certainty, where it had come from. She pictured him finding it, a lone spot of color blooming from a crack in a rock. She pictured him gently plucking it, carrying it all the way back, and leaving it here for her to find. It wasn't a grand bouquet of roses bought to impress. It was a small, wild, and incredibly precious thing. It was a piece of beauty he had found in this harsh world, and he had wanted to share it with her. It was a message in his silent language, and it spoke more eloquently than 1,000 pretty words. It said, "I see you. I see the part of you that, like this flower, can still find a way to bloom in the hardest of places." Her eyes stung with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She gently removed the flower from the bridle, its stem cool and delicate against her fingers. She didn't look over at Cody, who was pretending to be busy with a saddle buckle. She knew he was watching her. She didn't thank him. A word like thanks was too small for a gift like this. Instead, she carefully opened the top button of her dress and slipped the small, yellow flower inside, placing it in the small pocket of her chemise, where it would rest safely against her skin, close to her heart. That evening, when she served their simple meal of rabbit stew, she did not take her usual seat on the crate across the fire from him. She walked around the flames and sat down on the packed earth right next to him, close enough that her arm brushed against his. Cody didn't look at her, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch in the barest hint of a smile. He shifted his weight just slightly, a small movement towards her, closing the last inch of distance between them. And there they sat, side by side in the firelight, two solitary people who were, finally, no longer alone. The peace they had built was a fragile thing, as delicate as the yellow marigold Ellie now kept pressed between the pages of a discarded railroad ledger she'd found in the pump house. They had been at the water station for nearly a month, a lifetime in this new world they had made. The well gave them sweet, cold water, Cody's snares, and now hers, provided a steady supply of meat. They had patched the last of the holes in the roof. The pump house was no longer a ruin. It was a home, sanctified by their shared labor and the quiet trust that had grown between them. The morning of the day it ended was beautiful. A cool breeze stirred the air, a relief from the late summer heat. Ellie was on her knees by a small patch of earth they had tilled, coaxing a few stubborn bean seeds to sprout. Cody was on the roof of the water tower, methodically replacing a rotten plank. His hammer blows a steady, rhythmic punctuation to the morning silence. It was a sound of purpose, of permanence. It was the sound of a future. That was why the other sound was so jarring. It wasn't loud. It was a skitter of loose rock from the ridge to the east, a sound that did not belong to the wind or to any animal she knew. Ellie froze, her hand hovering over a fledgling plant. Above her, the hammering stopped. The silence that fell was absolute, a sudden, breathless vacuum. She looked up. Cody was a silhouette against the bright morning sky, perfectly still, his head cocked, listening. He had heard it too. He slid down the tower's ladder with a speed and silence that was unnerving. He landed on the balls of his feet without a sound, his eyes already scanning the ridge line. He didn't have to say a word. The piece was over. He moved to the pump house, grabbing his gun belt from a peg by the door and strapping it on. The familiar weight of it seemed to settle him, his movements becoming economical and precise. He looked at Ellie, his expression grim. "Inside," he said, his voice low. She didn't argue. She scrambled into the stone building, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She grabbed his rifle from its resting place against the wall. She checked the load, her hands steady despite the fear. This was the partnership they had built. He was the shield. She was the support. Through one of the grimy windows, she saw them, 3 riders, cresting the ridge, their figures dark against the sun. Even from a distance, she recognized the arrogant slump of the man in the lead, Austin Bragg. He rode his white mare as if it were a throne. On either side of him were 2 other men, their faces indistinct, but their rifles held at the ready gave them a grim purpose. It was Jed and Silas. She knew it in her bones. But they were not all. Trailing behind them, by a good 50 yards. Were two more riders. They weren't armed for a fight. They were just men from Dry Hollow, a rancher named Peterson and the blacksmith, Mr. Gable. They were not a posse. They were an audience. Austin hadn't come just to reclaim his property. He had come to put on a show. Cody stepped out of the pump house, into the full glare of the sun. He closed the heavy door behind him, leaving Ellie inside. He was not wearing his gun belt. He had taken it off and left it with the rifle. In his right hand, he held nothing but a coil of worn lariat rope, its loop dangling near the dusty ground. He walked 10 paces forward and stopped, planting his feet, a solitary, defiant figure in the vast, empty space between his home and his enemy. The 3 riders came on, their horses kicking up dust, and reined in about 30 feet from Cody. Austin's face was a mask of triumph and rage. His fine clothes were dusty and trail-worn, his face burned by the sun. The search had cost him his polished veneer, and what was left was ugly. "Well, well," Austin called out, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "Look what we have here, the thief, playing house in a ruin." His eyes scanned the pump house, the patched roof, the cleared ground. He saw the evidence of their life here, and his lip curled in a sneer. He looked past Cody, his gaze trying to pierce the stone walls of the house. "Ellie, come on out. Your little game is over." The door remained closed. Austin's eyes snapped back to Cody. He smirked. "Still hiding behind him. Some things never change. You always did have a taste for trash." Cody didn't react to the insult. He stood as still as the stone pump house behind him, his gray eyes fixed on Austin. His silence, his utter refusal to be provoked, seemed to infuriate Austin more than any angry words could have. "You really thought you could get away?" Austin's voice rose, cracking with manic energy. "You thought you could steal from me, humiliate me in front of the whole town, and just ride away?" He gestured grandly with his arm, a theatrical motion meant for the 2 men watching from the ridge. "There is nowhere you can go that my father's reach can't find you. My father is the law in this territory." It was his mantra, the source of all his power, the answer to every question. He had built his entire life on that single, unshakable fact. Cody finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. "Your father's law ends where the truth begins. Austin." The quiet defiance in that statement was like a spark to dry tinder. Austin's face contorted. "The truth," he spat. "The truth is I'm taking her back, and I'm taking you to a cell to rot." He nodded to his men. "Jed, Silas, take him!" The 2 hired guns began to dismount, their movements slow and uncertain. They were here for a paycheck, to intimidate a lone man. They hadn't counted on this cold, quiet resistance. But Austin couldn't wait. His pride, raw and festering, demanded immediate satisfaction. With a roar of pure rage, he spurred his white mare forward, intending to ride Cody down. He had misjudged his man. Cody didn't retreat. He didn't even flinch. As the horse lunged, he moved with the fluid grace of a man who understands animals and violence in equal measure. He took 1 step to the side, and as the horse thundered past, the lariat in his hand uncoiled. His wrist snapped, and the rope flew, a living thing in the air. It wasn't aimed at Austin. It sailed under the horse's belly, and Cody pulled back hard. The rope cinched tight around the mare's back legs. The horse screamed, a sound of terror and surprise. As its legs were yanked out from under it, it crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and a cloud of dust. Austin was thrown clear, landing with a sickening thud on his shoulder, his pistol flying from its holster and skittering across the hard-packed earth. Jed and Silas froze, their hands hovering near their own guns, their eyes wide. This was not going according to plan. Cody didn't press the attack. He just stood there, the end of the rope in his hand, his eyes on the 2 gunmen. The message was clear. "I am not the easy target you thought I would be." Austin staggered to his feet, his face a mess of dust and blood from a cut on his cheek. His arm hung at an odd angle. Humiliation radiated from him in waves. He was no longer the confident son of the law. He was just a man who had been pulled from his horse and thrown in the dirt. He looked at Cody with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Kill him!" he shrieked at his men, clutching his injured shoulder. "I'll pay you double. Just kill him." Jed and Silas exchanged a nervous glance. They began to raise their rifles. From inside the pump house, there was a loud, metallic click. It was the sound of a rifle being cocked. They both froze, their eyes darting to the dark window of the stone building. They were no longer facing one man with a rope. They were facing a fortified position with at least one rifle. Their odds had just gotten considerably worse. And it was in that moment of tense, frozen indecision that the heavy wooden door of the pump house swung open. Ellie stepped out into the sunlight. She was not holding the rifle. She stood on the threshold, her face pale but her eyes burning with a fire that eclipsed the sun. She took a step forward, and another, until she was standing just behind Cody's shoulder. She was no longer hiding. She was taking her place in the battle. She looked past the gunmen, her gaze locking on the two onlookers still sitting on their horses on the ridge. She drew in a deep, steadying breath. Her voice, when it came, was not a scream. It was a clear, ringing pronouncement, a bell of truth in the silent desert. Mr. Peterson, Mr. Gable, she called out, her voice carrying with astonishing power. "You want to know what the truth is? You want to know about the man Austin Bragg calls a thief?" All eyes snapped to her. Austin's face went slack with shock. This was not part of his script. The woman he saw as a meek, controllable possession was speaking with the force of a prophet. "The man who stole the Miller horses 3 years ago wasn't Cody Lane," she declared, her voice rising with every word. She raised a trembling hand and pointed a finger directly at the man struggling to his feet in the dust. "It was him. It was Austin Bragg, and his 2 hired guns right there. Cody saw them. He saw them, and they threatened to kill him if he ever told. They beat him and left him for the posse to find Austin Bragg is the thief, he is the liar." The silence that followed was more profound than the silence after the sandstorm. Her words hung in the air, seeming to shimmer in the heat. They were an impossible accusation, an unthinkable truth. Austin just stared, his mouth agape. His prepared speeches and threats turned to ash in his mouth. Jed and Silas looked at each other, their faces suddenly pale. The story she told was too specific, too accurate. She knew, someone knew. Their lucrative arrangement with the sheriff's son had just become a liability that could see them hanged. But the most important reaction came from the ridge. Mr. Peterson and Mr. Gable looked at each other, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. It was a wild story, but it made a certain kind of sense. It explained Cody Lane's quiet endurance. It explained the lack of evidence, and it fit perfectly with the arrogant, above-the-law attitude Austin Bragg had always displayed. A whisper started between them, a low murmur that drifted down into the basin. The town had gossiped about Cody for years. Now, they had a new story to tell. Austin, seeing the tide turn, seeing his audience, his power, slipping away, finally found his voice. "She's lying. The girl is hysterical. He's twisted her mind." But his denials were weak, panicked. The authority was gone from his voice. It was replaced by a shrill, desperate whine. Cody didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He stood his ground, the rope still in his hand, and watched as the truth, once spoken, began to do its work. Ellie stood beside him, no longer behind him, and she did not waver. The physical fight was over. The real one had just begun, and it would not be won with bullets or fists, but with a single, undeniable whisper of truth that was now, finally, on the wind. The echo of Ellie's accusation faded, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. On the ridge, Mr. Peterson and Mr. Gable were frozen, 2 statues of disbelief. Down in the basin, Jed and Silas, the hired guns, had not moved. Their rifles were half raised, their eyes darting between the furious, humiliated Austin, the unmoving Cody, and the woman who had just signed their death warrant if her story was believed. They were paid for violence, not for a public trial that could end with a noose around their own necks. Slowly, deliberately, Jed lowered his rifle. He gave Silas a look that was pure, self-interested pragmatism. Silas nodded once, his own rifle barrel dipping towards the ground. Without a word to the man who had hired them, they began to back away towards their horses. Their loyalty had a price, and the risk had just become too high. "Where are you going?" Austin shrieked, his voice thin and panicked. "I'm paying you! Get him!" They didn't even look back. They mounted their horses and, with a final, nervous glance at the scene, spurred their animals into a gallop, riding hard for the open desert, disappearing in a cloud of their own dust. They were erasing themselves from the story. Austin was alone. His power, which had always been borrowed from his father and projected through men he could buy, had evaporated into the thin desert air. He stared at Ellie, his face a mess of confusion and pure hatred. The narrative he had controlled for so long had been stolen from him. On the ridge, "Mister," Gable turned his horse. We should get back," he said to Peterson, his voice a low, troubled murmur that carried down to the basin. "The town needs to hear about this." They rode off, not with the haste of the gunmen, but with the heavy, somber pace of men carrying a terrible and important truth. Now it was just the three of them. Austin, clutching his shoulder, looked from Ellie's unwavering gaze to Cody's silent form. The fight was over. He had lost. With a strangled sob of fury and defeat, he stumbled towards his horse, which had struggled back to its feet. He clumsily hauled himself into the saddle and, without a backward glance, rode away, a solitary, broken figure heading back towards the town whose laws he thought he owned. Ellie let out a long, shaky breath, the strength that had held her up so fiercely suddenly leaving her. She felt Cody's hand on her arm, a steady, grounding presence. She leaned against him for just a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had just won, not with guns, but with a truth that had been buried for 3 long years. The ride back to Dry Hollow was nothing like their flight from it. They rode side by side, their pace measured and deliberate. They were not running anymore. They were returning. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows before them, as if their own small story was now a part of the vast landscape. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. Now, all that remained was to see if the seeds of truth Ellie had sown would find fertile ground, or if they would be choked out by the deep-rooted power of the Bragg name. As they approached the town limits, they could feel the change. People stopped in the street to stare. Faces appeared in windows. The usual evening bustle of the main street slowed to a crawl. The whispers followed them like a trail of dust. Mr. Peterson and Mr. Gable had done their work. The story was loose. They didn't ride to the sheriff's office. They didn't ride to the Bragg house. Cody led them to the livery stable, the very place where Ellie had stood in the shadows, a prisoner of charity, just a month before. He dismounted and then helped her down, his hands gentle on her waist. They stood there, in the middle of the dusty street, and waited. The town came to them. People emerged from the saloon, from the general store, from their homes. They formed a loose, silent circle around the two of them. It was not a hostile crowd. It was a confused, curious, and deeply unsettled one. They were a people whose simple, black-and-white world had just been turned into a murky, uncertain gray. Then 2 figures appeared, parting the crowd. Sheriff Thaddeus Bragg walked with a stiff, heavy tread, his face a mask of stone. Beside him, his deputy, a young, nervous man named Miller, looked at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eye. Austin was not with them. Sheriff Bragg stopped 10 feet from them. He did not look at his son's accusers. He looked at the faces of the townspeople, the men and women who had elected him, who had trusted his word and his law for 15 years. He saw the doubt in their eyes. He saw the whispers on their lips. "There are stories," the sheriff said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He was trying to reclaim control. Wild accusations being made by a troubled girl and a known horse thief. Before he could continue, Ellie stepped forward. She was no longer the frightened girl who had served him at his own table. Her voice was calm and steady, and it rang with an authority that had been forged in the desert. "I am not troubled, Sheriff Bragg," she said, her eyes meeting his without fear. "And Cody Lane is not a thief." She turned to the crowd, to the faces she knew, the women who had whispered about her, the men who had looked away. "I lived in his house for a year. You all called it charity, but it was a cage. His son, Austin, treated me like an animal he had bought at a fair. And when I finally found the courage to leave, he hunted me. He sent men to hurt Cody, a man whose only crime was to see the truth and be punished for it." She told them everything. She told them about the night in the kitchen, about the constant surveillance, about Austin's possessive rage, and then she told them Cody's story. The story from the letter, of the night by Crow Creek, of the laughter and the threats and the cold. Calculated cruelty of a powerful man's son who knew he would never have to pay for his sins. As she spoke, she could see the truth of it landing in their eyes. They remembered Austin's arrogance, his casual cruelty to those he deemed beneath him. They remembered Cody's quiet, stubborn refusal to be driven away, his lonely endurance. The wild accusation began to sound like a plausible, terrible truth. When she was finished, a deep, profound silence fell over the street. All eyes turned to the sheriff. His stone facade was beginning to crack. His son's character, which he had always excused as youthful high spirits, was now on trial in the court of public opinion. Mr. Peterson, the rancher, stepped forward. "Sheriff," he said, his voice heavy with respect for the office, but firm with conviction. "I was there. I heard the girl. I saw Austin's face, and I saw his hired men ride away. They ran, Sheriff, like guilty men run." That was the final blow, the testimony of one of their own. Sheriff Bragg seemed to age 10 years in that single moment. The power, the certainty, drained out of him, leaving behind a tired, defeated old man. He looked at Cody for the first time, a long, searching look. Perhaps he saw the truth in Cody's steady, unblinking gaze. Perhaps he was just a father who finally had to face the monster his own indulgence had created. He unpinned the silver star from his vest, the star that had been the source of his identity, his power. The metal seemed dull and tarnished in the fading light. He held it in his palm for a moment, then pressed it into the hand of his stunned deputy. "Austin is at the house," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "He needs a doctor for his shoulder. Go and do your duty, Miller." And with that, he turned and walked away, not towards his office, but towards his empty house. He walked like a man heading to his own funeral. The crowd parted for him, a silent, final act of deference for the man who had been their law for so long. Deputy Miller, the silver star a heavy, unfamiliar weight in his hand, looked at Cody and Ellie, then at the expectant faces of the crowd. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, stood up straight. "Mr. Lane," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, "the town owes you an apology." He then turned and walked with purpose towards the Bragg house. Justice, it seemed, no longer required the Bragg name to function. In the days that followed, the town tried to make amends. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Cody now nodded to him, a new respect in their eyes. The blacksmith offered to shoe his horses for free. Mrs. Gable, the sheriff's former housekeeper, stopped Ellie in the street and, with tears in her eyes, apologized for not seeing, for not speaking up. The town wanted to absorb them, to heal the wound by pretending it had never been so deep. But Cody did not belong to them anymore. If he ever had, He accepted their apologies with a quiet, non-committal nod. But he made no move to rejoin the life of the town. The brand of thief had been removed, but the scar remained. He had learned to live without their approval, and he found he did not need it now. He and Ellie stayed at the livery, their future an unspoken question between them. One evening, as the sun set, they walked to the edge of town, looking out at the vast, open desert that had been both their prison and their sanctuary. "I'm not staying," Cody said. It wasn't a question or a proposal. It was a simple statement of fact. "There's a piece of land a day's ride south of here, old homestead, abandoned. Got a creek that runs in the spring. It's nothing but rock and scrub, but it's quiet, and it's no one's but the sky's." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. He was not asking her to come. He was telling her his path and letting her choose her own. She was free. She could stay here, in Dry Hollow. The town would accept her now. She could find a safe, respectable life. She thought of that life, a life of polite conversation, of Sunday church services, of mending and baking and slowly forgetting the feel of the wind in her hair. She thought of the whispers that would always follow her, the pity and the curiosity. Then she thought of the hard, beautiful life they had made at the water station. She thought of the satisfaction of patching a roof with her own hands, of the taste of water drawn from a well she had helped to dig. She thought of Cody's silent language, of a wildflower left on a bridle, of a hand on her shoulder in the dark. She looked out at the barren land he spoke of, and she did not see emptiness. She saw a clean slate. She saw a place where a life could be built, not inherited, a life that belonged only to them. She turned to him and smiled, the first truly light-hearted smile she had felt in years. "Well," she said softly, "that roof probably needs patching." He held her gaze for a long moment, and a slow, rare smile spread across his own face, lighting his eyes from within. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. She took it. His palm was rough and calloused against hers, a hand made for work, for survival, for holding on. They left the next morning. They rode out of Dry Hollow, not as fugitives, but as pioneers. They left the whispers and the apologies behind them, seeking a justice that was not given, but made. They found the old homestead just as he'd described it, a small, collapsed sod house, its roof open to the sky, its walls crumbling, a forgotten place at the edge of the world. To anyone else, it would have looked like a ruin. To them, it looked like a foundation. They began the work. They cleared the fallen sod and stone. They cut new timber from the cottonwoods by the creek. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their movements a familiar, comfortable rhythm. They planted a small garden with seeds they had bought with their last few coins, their hands in the same dirt. They built a corral for the horses. Slowly, day by day, a home began to emerge from the ruin. It wasn't a grand house like the Braggs, but it was theirs. Every stone, every plank, every sprouting seed was a testament to their shared future, a quiet monument to a love that had been forged in the harshest of lands. The seasons began to turn. The relentless heat of summer softened into the golden, forgiving light of autumn. The small homestead, once a ruin, was now a testament to their shared will. The sod house stood firm, its new roof tight against the sky. The garden, a stubborn patch of green against the vast brown, had yielded a small but precious harvest of beans and squash. The horses were healthy, and the creek, though it ran low, still provided a steady trickle of life. This new life was measured in small, quiet moments. It was in the comfortable silence as they worked side by side, each knowing their task. It was in the way Ellie would look up from her mending to see Cody watching her, a soft, unguarded look on his face that he quickly hid when she met his gaze. It was in the way he would leave a perfectly shaped, smooth stone he'd found by the creek on the windowsill for her, a silent gift with no occasion but the day itself. Love, in this quiet corner of the world, was not a grand declaration. It was a language of gestures, a story told in shared burdens and small, unspoken kindnesses. It was the warmth of his hand brushing hers as they both reached for the water bucket. It was the taste of the stew she made, seasoned with wild herbs she had found. It was the safety she felt when she woke in the night and heard the soft, steady sound of his breathing from his bedroll across the small room. One morning, the air was so clear and bright it felt newly made. Ellie was outside, humming softly to herself as she knelt by their small garden, pulling the last of the season's weeds. A light breeze whispered through the cottonwood trees, carrying the sweet, earthy scent of life. She felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling so foreign and so welcome it almost brought tears to her eyes. This small patch of earth was the first place she had ever truly felt at home. The first place where she belonged not by debt or by force, but by choice. She heard his footsteps behind her and didn't have to look up to know it was him. His walk was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. He stopped beside her, his shadow falling over her. She finished pulling a stubborn weed and looked up at him, shielding her eyes from the sun. "The fence post by the corral is solid," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "Should hold through the winter." "That's good," she said, smiling. "I was worried about the wind." He didn't move. He just stood there, looking down at her, a strange, serious expression on his face. In his hands, he held a small, lumpy object wrapped in a piece of old, faded calico cloth. It was the kind of sturdy, practical fabric a homesteader might use to patch a shirt or wrap a piece of bread. "I have something," he said, his voice hesitant. "Something for you to see." He knelt down in the dirt beside her, the movement surprisingly graceful for such a strong man. He held out the small bundle. His hands, usually so steady and sure, seemed uncertain. Ellie wiped the dirt from her own hands onto her apron and gently took the object from him. The fabric was soft and worn, and whatever was inside was hard and flat, with a distinct shape. She looked at him, a question in her eyes, but he just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, telling her to open it. Her fingers worked at the knot he had tied. She unfolded the cloth carefully. Lying in the center of the faded calico was a sheriff's star. It was made of tin or cheap silver, and it was tarnished a deep, mottled gray. The points were bent, and the surface was pitted with rust, as if it had been buried for a very long time. The pin on the back was long gone. It was a relic, a ghost of a thing, a symbol of a law that had long since been corrupted and forgotten. She looked up at him, her heart filled with a sudden, aching sadness for the man he might have been, for the dream this broken thing represented. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. He looked away, out towards the endless horizon, as if the story were written out there. "It was my father's," he said, his voice quiet. "He wasn't a lawman long, just a few years, in a small town back in Ohio. He believed in it. He believed that the star meant something, that it was a promise, to be fair, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He taught me that." He paused, a shadow passing over his face. "He was killed, ambushed by a man he had sent to prison. My mother and we moved on, but I kept it. I was just a boy. I kept it because it was all I had left of him." He finally looked back at her, his gray eyes holding a world of old pain. "I carried it with me for years, through all the long, lonely nights. I thought that maybe, one day, I would be worthy of it, that I could be the man he was, that I could wear a star of my own and make it mean what he believed it meant." He reached out and gently touched the rusted metal with the tip of his finger. A bitter, weary smile touched his lips. "I used to dream of wearing this," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "But after what Bragg and his boys showed me, after seeing what the law can become in the hands of men like them, I don't need it anymore. A piece of tin doesn't make a man decent, and it can't make a crooked man straight." He looked at her, and his expression softened. "The promise my father believed in. It's not in a badge. It's in the work of your own two hands. It's in building a place like this. It's in standing for someone when no one else will. Ellie looked down at the tarnished star in her palm. It represented a world of lies, of power used to hurt and control. It was the world of Bragg, of Blackwood, a world of cages. Then she looked at the man beside her, a man who had been stripped of his name, his reputation, and his freedom, all by the false power of a star like this one. A man who, despite all that, had held on to his own quiet, unshakable code of honor. She gently closed her hand around the old badge, the bent points pressing into her palm. Then she reached out with her other hand and took his fingers, rough and strong, closed around hers instantly. "You don't need a silver star, Cody," she said, her voice soft but fierce with a conviction that came from the very core of her soul. "You have never needed one." She held his gaze, pouring all the love, all the gratitude, all the respect she felt for him into her eyes. "Because I chose you," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I chose you in front of that whole town, not because you were a hero with a gun. I chose you because of the man you were in the dark. I chose you because you chose to stay silent to save your own life, and then you still chose to protect mine." A wave of emotion passed over his face, surprise, relief, and a deep, profound love that needed no words. He had carried the shame of that choice for so long, and with her words, she had finally lifted it from his shoulders. She had not just seen his past, she had understood it and honored it. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. She held the badge for a moment longer, then placed it carefully back on its cloth wrapping. It was a part of his past, but it had no place in their future. She stood up, still holding his hand, and pulled him to his feet. They stood together, looking out at the land they now called home. In the distance, a wide, shallow basin that was usually brown and barren was now covered in a thick, glorious carpet of yellow. The late-season rains had performed their magic, and thousands of desert marigolds had sprung from the earth, a river of gold flowing through the landscape. Without a word, they began to walk towards it, their hands clasped tightly between them. They walked away from the house they had built, away from the ghosts of their past. The wind picked up, a gentle, steady breeze that stirred the golden heads of the flowers. It was the same wind that had once carried the stinging sand of the storm, the same wind that had carried the whispers and lies of Dry Hollow. But today, the wind was different. It no longer carried only dust. It carried the sweet, clean scent of the marigolds. It carried the promise of the coming winter, and the spring that would follow. It carried a sound that was, to them, the most beautiful music in the world. It carried peace. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a thumbs up, and consider hitting the hype button to help more people discover and enjoy our stories.